It's difficult being a woman in a men's prison. I have faced rape, being assaulted, discrimination.
Being referred as he can be sometimes degrading.
Imagine being a woman, but the world sees and treats you as a man. Now imagine that, as a transgender woman, you are sent to an all-male prison. Scary, right? But this is reality for many trans women in the United States and around the world. In the US criminal justice system, it's common for transgender women, people who were born male but identify as women, to be put in men's prisons. This happens because many states don't legally recognize a person's gender identity, only the sex they were assigned at birth. So transgender women often end up locked up with men, facing a high risk of harassment, sexual assault, and violence. Can you imagine the fear of being a woman in a prison full of men, some of whom may wish you harm? The emotional pain is huge. Tragically, sexual abuse is very common. A 2015 survey found that trans prisoners are 5 to 6 times more likely to be sexually assaulted by other inmates compared to the general prison population. This is the horrifying reality trans women face in men's prisons. How can this happen in a developed country like the US? Why are trans women's rights, safety, and dignity being ignored in prison? It comes down to many states refusing to acknowledge that transgender people exist and banning them from legally changing their gender. Let's look closer at how this plays out across the nation and world. The US incarcerates more people than any other nation on earth. Over 2 million are behind bars in state and federal prisons and local jails. And within that population, research suggests there are nearly 5,000 transgender prisoners in the US.
But according to an NBC News investigation, of the 4,890 incarcerated trans people currently being tracked nationally, only 15 are housed according to their lived gender. 6 states, which account for nearly 40% of the total incarcerated transgender population, cited privacy concerns and declined to provide housing data. 5 states failed to provide any information at all.
Trans people, in general, face high rates of exclusion, poverty, homelessness, and criminalization. 1 in 6 trans Americans has been to prison. For Black trans people, it's 1 in 2. Trans people are often profiled and targeted by police and face discrimination in the courts.
But for many trans women serving time with men, sexual violence is the real fear. According to the Justice Department, 35% of incarcerated trans people report being sexually assaulted, either by other prisoners or prison staff. LGBTQ advocates believe the real numbers may actually be far higher, but prisoners fear retaliation for reporting attacks.
The root of this problem is prisons housing people based on gender given at birth rather than their chosen gender. Locking transgender women up with men is extremely dangerous and harmful. It exposes them to severe risk of sexual violence, harassment, physical attacks, and psychological trauma. In the US, each state makes its own laws about legally recognizing gender. Currently, the policies are a confusing mix. Some states have more progressive laws that let a person change their legal gender on IDs, but many other states make it very hard or ban changing gender markers entirely. For example, Idaho, Ohio, Tennessee, and Texas don't allow a transgender person to update the gender on their birth certificate at all. So in the eyes of the law in these states, trans women are men and trans men are women, no matter how they identify and live.
For many of these trans incarcerated people, they'd rather be housed with the gender they identify with, something prisons are required by the Federal Prison Rape Elimination Act to consider on a case-by-case basis.
You may wonder, why does a gender marker on a birth certificate matter? Well, it's usually the basis for the gender on other key IDs and legal records, like driver's licenses, passports, and social security cards. It affects many areas of life, like housing, jobs, healthcare, and importantly, prison placement if a person is convicted of a crime. So, in states with strict laws, if a trans woman is convicted of a crime, she is processed as male and sent to a men's prison because that's the gender on her documents. Even if she's been living as a woman for years, has had gender-affirming surgery, takes female hormones, and is legally female in another state, it doesn't matter. That state considers her male, so it's a men's prison.
The first time that I went to jail, to have to come into a facility where there's nothing but men,
It
terrifying. It's intimidating, it's scary. Everybody is grabbing and pulling for any bit of happiness because there's none here.
This is terrifying for trans women at the mercy of the criminal justice system in these places. Even for minor nonviolent crimes, a trans woman can end up locked in with male inmates, some of whom commit violence, sexual assault, and hate crimes against trans people. It's very dangerous. Even in states that technically allow gender changes on birth certificates, the process is often extremely complicated and expensive. It can require proof of surgery, which many trans people don't want, can't afford, or aren't medically able to get. Some states require a court order that takes months. Minors are generally barred from gender ID changes. All these legal obstacles mean many trans people can't get IDs matching their identity. So trans women keep getting sent to men's prisons across much of the country. It's a major problem that puts their safety and lives at risk. The effects are devastating. Other countries handle this issue in various ways. Some places make it easier for trans people to change legal gender, using systems based on self-identification rather than surgery. For example, Argentina, Denmark, Ireland, Malta, Norway, and Pakistan allow gender changes without medical requirements. When trans people can get identity documents matching their gender, it helps ensure they are placed in the correct prison for their safety. However, implementation varies, and some nations still house trans women in men's prisons. Some places, like Ontario, Canada, and Mexico City, have policies to house trans prisoners based on their gender identity rather than anatomy or legal documents. But globally, the placement of trans prisoners based on birth-assigned sex is still very common, despite advocacy efforts. Clearly, there is much more work to be done, both in the US and worldwide, to ensure that trans people are housed safely in prison according to their lived gender. The consequences of misgendering trans women by putting them in men's prisons are severe. Most are put in men's facilities or in solitary protective custody. Nearly 90% of trans inmates have been placed into solitary confinement at some point of their incarceration, sometimes for lengthy periods. Even the most progressive states have not done nearly enough to ensure safety for trans women in their prisons. Despite some policy changes, the vast majority continue to be housed as men. The institutional culture of prisons is still extremely transphobic and resistant to reform. Some trans women get put in solitary confinement, supposedly for protection, but isolation creates severe psychological harm and prevents them from accessing services. It's like a double punishment.
The sentence in coming to state prison, that's the punishment, right? There shouldn't be an additional punishment. You shouldn't be required to identify a different way simply because you committed a crime and you've been given a sentence.
The loss of dignity is another daily degradation. Being misgendered, dead-named, made to wear men's clothes, and barred from expressing femininity chips away at self-worth. Being a trans woman in a men's prison is a daily fight for survival. While most trans women in prison simply want to be housed safely as women, there have been a few disturbing cases of male prisoners seemingly exploiting transgender policies to get moved to women's facilities. In rare instances, some imprisoned men have claimed a transgender identity under questionable circumstances. The fear is that predatory men could take advantage of self-ID policies meant to protect trans women to access vulnerable women in prison. One case that sparked outrage was that of Demi Minor, a trans woman in New Jersey. In 2022, news broke that while housed in the women's prison, Minor had impregnated 2 fellow inmates. This led some to accuse Minor of not being truly transgender and gaming the system.
She was born male, but she started her transition as a woman in 2020. Minor has been blogging about her experience in the men's facility. She says she's suffered physical and psychological abuse despite her own actions of getting women pregnant in the female facility.
However, the truth is more complex. Minor did genuinely identify as a woman and had transferred to the women's prison legally after much scrutiny. The relationships were consensual, and the women were devastated by Minor's removal back to the men's prison after the scandal. Still, the situation inflamed transphobic arguments that housing trans women with women is dangerous. Minor received death threats, and the case was used to argue against all trans women being in women's prisons.
Jamie, does this hurt your movement when people hear stories like this? Someone
who says they are transgender female and then goes into a prison and get 2 females pregnant? Does that hurt the movement or those who are fighting for transgender rights around this country?
Oh, it absolutely does. It absolutely does, because it feeds into the fears that people already have where trans people are concerned.
But it's crucial to recognize that the vast majority of trans women are not faking to abuse women. They are far more likely to be victims of abuse themselves at men's prisons. One awful case should not be used to deny all trans women their basic human rights. What's needed are thoughtful policies that assess individual risks and needs. Blanket rules don't work. Decisions about placement should involve careful screening, input from medical and psych staff, checking for red flags, and monitoring afterwards. But the conversation often gets stopped by irrational fears, painting all trans women as predatory. This false stereotype is transphobic and not supported by evidence. Sadly, bad faith actors often cherry-pick these few edge cases to fearmonger about trans women in general. They invoke the specter of men in dresses to deny trans women basic rights and paint them as threats.
So I get to the county jail and I get undressed, and they was like, when I take off my shirt, it's like, okay, is this individual a man or is a female? So one of the things that they wanted to ask the question, I could see it in their face because I had breasts at that point. So I told them, I said, I was born male, but at night I identify as female. So it was like, okay, we got you in the right spot.
In recent years, brave trans women and LGBTQ advocates have filed a wave of lawsuits fighting for the right to safe, gender-affirming treatment behind bars. They are challenging the cruel, unconstitutional conditions trans people face in prison and demanding change. Many seek not only damages for suffering, but also systemic reforms to protect all trans prisoners. A few states, like Connecticut and California, have passed laws to house trans inmates by gender identity, but this is usually decided on a case-by-case basis. Due to some ill intentions of some inmates, some also push for reducing incarceration of trans people overall through decriminalization, diversion to alternatives, and investing in community support services to address factors like poverty, homelessness, and trauma that funnel so many into prisons. Internationally, the United Nations has issued guidelines on protecting LGBTQ prisoners' human rights. It specifies that trans prisoners should be housed based on their gender identity or where they feel safest. This is due to the fact they are put into solitary confinement for extended periods of time, which according to the UN is a form of torture. Although it could be seen to be protecting the LGBTQ inmates, it can also have long-lasting effects on their mental health. However, the backlash has also been fierce. Many conservative politicians and anti-trans groups are fighting tooth and nail against any reforms. They spread fear-mongering myths about trans prisoners despite the lack of evidence. So, what do you think? Should trans women be allowed to transfer to women's prisons? Or is it too complex an issue for a blanket ruling? There are valid concerns on both sides. We need to protect women from any potential abusers gaming the system, but the much more widespread danger is men assaulting trans women in men's prisons. Trans women are far more at risk. Currently, the harsh reality is that most trans women are housed by assigned sex at birth, not their female gender identity. This is true even in progressive states. The result is rampant sexual abuse, violence, and trauma. Things are starting to shift as trans inmates gain more legal rights, but the progress is slow and patchwork. The suffering continues every day that trans women are locked up with male prisoners.
I know some girls are going to want to stay here because they want to be around the men. But if you identify as a female, then I think you should be housed around females, and I think that would eliminate a lot of the problems of being sexually assaulted, of being raped, pressured.
At the end of the day, ask yourself this: how would you feel if you or a trans loved one were ever locked up? Wouldn't you want them to be safe and treated as who they are? Transgender rights are human rights. They don't stop at the prison gates. Mass incarceration has ravaged trans communities, especially trans people of color, for far too long. It's a systemic crisis that demands bold, transformative solutions. Changing the brutal conditions trans women face inside prisons is only the start.